Hello and a very warm welcome. In the middle of a global pandemic, China has been flexing its military muscle, not just along the Himalayan Range, but also in the South China Sea. China's belligerence has brought alive once again the need for countries that are threatened by China's aggressive military maneuvers to come together in a strategy to contain China in what's most commonly been called the Quad or the Quad plus access. The Quad so far has been an informal consultative mechanism comprising the United States, Japan, Australia and India. If the Quad is to be re-energized and reinvigorated, what form should it take? Can this be an effective alliance to counter and contain China's military aggression? For a global perspective on this very important conversation, I am joined live and exclusive on India Today Newstrack at this time by Admiral Shekhar Sinha. Admiral Sinha is a former chief of the Integrated Defence Staff. He's been Commander-in-Chief of the Western Naval Command based in Mumbai. He's currently on the Executive Council of the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. With us also on this broadcast is Dr. Ian Hall. Ian Hall is a professor at the School of Government and International Relations at the Griffith University in Australia. He's an academic fellow at the Australia-India Institute and the University of Melbourne. He's far and away one of Australia's top India experts. Andrew Luing is a former Hong Kong official. He's been in various portfolios: finance, industry, social welfare, overseas representation, and over the last few years since his retirement, he's been across media internationally as a leading China strategist. Last but not least, I have Professor Amitabh Mattu. Professor Mattu is at the Disarmament Studies at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He understands the Indo-Pacific region very, very closely and is a top expert in arms control and disarmament. So welcome to all our guests. I want to start by asking Professor Mattu first.
India face right now is a continental threat. So while the promise of the Quad is limited to the Indo-Pacific at the moment, we have to recognize that there are continental dimensions of the China threat which will need to be addressed. After all, once this is done and gone by, you'll need to address the huge intelligence failure of what happened in the Galwan Heights. So I think there is a tremendous promise. There's a recognition, but how quickly we can act and act together, it remains to be seen. There is greater political will for sure, but there are huge challenges, and China is not going to, you can't assume that China will sit there and just watch this happening. In the past, it's issued demarches, virtual demarches to Australia and to other countries about groups getting together. But at that stage, there was a promise that China would become another reasonable power, socialized into the international system, and wouldn't turn out to be the hegemonic revisionist monster that it seems to be becoming.
So Admiral Shekhar Sinha, what's your sense of how the military and intelligence sharing dynamic of the Quad can evolve? So far, India was following what it thought was a policy of strategic autonomy. We've seen with China's maneuvers along the line of actual control, that policy needs to be relooked. Do you believe strengthening the Quad and giving it a greater military role will actually help in deter China, or will it just make China poke us more, not just in the seas, but even further in the Himalayas?
Rahul, to assume that China will focus only on the land border, to my mind, it is incorrect. Because, if you see the 2015 military strategy paper of China, in very clear terms, it says to imagine that the superiority of land makes a country powerful, that idea needs to be abandoned. He uses the word abandoned. And now China sees the future of the prosperity overseas, and therefore China is going to make the CCP Navy, or plan as it is called, a very strong force to make sure that wherever there is an interest of China, the economic interest, our plan is there, and therefore plan is, or the CCP Navy is now a strategic weapon and not one of the armed forces, the normal armed forces. So therefore, if you find that if China has said that very openly in the white paper, and thereafter it has been building the Navy so strong, you would have seen that the second aircraft carrier is doing a trial. You got 8 destroyers being produced every year with very potent weapon. It's only a matter of time that China will begin to start wanting a domination in the Indian Ocean. And China understands it very well. So, as you asked me, the importance of Quad, look, Rahul, everybody is talking about post-COVID international order. And what it means is, to my mind, it is an international order in economy and international order in security. Right now, the Americans are the sole superpower. They dominate both these areas of power of a state, which is economy and military, but it looks like that the economic power is likely to crumble down and America might come into number 2 place. And China knows this. Unfortunately, China has thought that even in the military part, it is already capable of taking on the US. I think it's a decade too early. He has only preempted this, and he's come to realize now that it is not easy for him to get past this, because Quad initially was believed to be only a economic sort of togetherness, but now it is Australia is very much on board with the present Prime Minister. The bilateral agreement we have with all 3 countries in the Quad, we have that intelligence sharing mechanism. That work is already happening. It is not that it is work in progress. We are already sharing all intelligence up to date, and all that remains is to get them on one maritime domain awareness platform so that it is not in bits and pieces. So Quad will do that. Now, including Australia in the Malabar.
Dr. Ian Hall, what role do you see the Quad play from an Australian perspective? Australia has been wanting to come and participate in the Malabar naval exercises. Earlier, it was the Australian government of the past which was under Chinese pressure. This government pushing back far more forcefully than in the past. How would Australia like to see the Quad evolve over the next few months, Dr. Hall?
Look, I think Australia has been pretty happy in the way that the Quad has emerged and it has evolved in the last few years since it was reconvened in 2017. Clearly, all 4 countries have established a number of areas in which they can cooperate profitably and usefully together, either as 4 or as 2 or as 3. There's conversations about how best to configure the Quad countries, if you like, to tackle particular issues, whether that's infrastructure issues or cybersecurity, a whole range of other things. Australia would clearly very much welcome being invited back into Malabar, and I think would have no issues with accepting that invitation. It's been unfortunate that Australia hasn't been involved for more than a decade now in those exercises, but obviously we've also worked very well together bilaterally in the Oz Index exercise, for example, and of course Australia's Navy is able to work alongside India's Navy, Japan, and so on in the US-led RIMPAC exercises that are run out of Hawaii. Now, over the next few months or so, I expect there's going to be much more of a tightening up and a clarifying of areas of responsibility, if you like. So we talked a little bit about the issue of this is a challenge at sea as well as a challenge on land. The challenge on land predominantly for India. But at sea, we've just seen a document being published by the Defence Department in Australia that has reconfigured our strategic geography and put the emphasis very much on our cooperation with India and with Indonesia, allowing the United States Navy and allowing the Japanese to focus on Northeast Asia and on maritime security and on managing the emerging problems, the assertion that we're seeing in the Senkakus and the South China Sea and so on. It's going to be up to
Andrew
us,
Lund, how do you see
few months and years to work on what we do in the Bay of Bengal, through the Malacca and through the Indonesian archipelago.
Andrew Leung, how do you see Beijing react to now what seems inevitable? For a while, countries like Australia and India weren't pushing ahead with the Quad with full gusto because there was a apprehension about antagonizing China. After what's happened along the line of actual control, I don't think too many in Delhi care very much about whether China is upset or not. They will do whatever is required to bolster India's national security. So now that the Quad is likely to get greater impetus, how do you see Beijing react to what is very clearly, whether anybody accepts it or not, an anti-China coalition of countries that just don't like China's aggression and belligerence, especially in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, I think from China's perspective, I think that Beijing is very, very cool-headed about this, in the sense that it realizes that as it grows stronger economically, as my colleague just pointed out, it's quite likely that over the next maybe 20 or 30 years, it's going to be the largest economy in the world. I think that this kind of ascendance is going to cause problems, particularly, of course, national security and territorial integrity are, of course, important for any country. Of course, India included, China included. No country is likely to give in to that. So I think that this kind of confrontation is not totally unexpected. But as far as the South China Sea is concerned, let's not forget, it's not just about territorial integrity. For China, it's the very important conduit for China's economic lifeblood, the trade, importation of raw materials from all over the world, particularly those transit of goods and materials are subject to various choke points. I mean, in the South China Sea, for example, there are the kind of two island chains dominated by the United States Navy and the military. Talking about hegemony, of course, that there is an existing hegemon, that's the United States, and that, of course, is very threatening to China's sense of national security. Now, as far as the Quad is concerned, I think that there is a great deal of course, opportunities for intelligence sharing, as in the case of the Five Eyes. But I think for China, the phenomenon of screwing influence is not out of design, it's out of its natural development. China is now the largest, second largest economy in the world, and is now the largest trading partner for more countries compared with the United States, many more countries compared with the United States. And there is a great deal of mutual independence. And indeed, many countries depend on China for spare parts, some manufacturing. Now, some of this would be decoupled because of this kind of China scared. When China is now being demonized the whole world over. But I don't think that a complete decoupling is possible because China is embedded in almost everything. Talk about India, for example. India, the medical, pharmaceutical industry, of course, very, very important for India. But if you look at the kind of input in the pharmaceutical industry, more than 80% of the kind of ingredients and so on and so forth come from China. And indeed, that China is investing in India, and there is a great deal of opportunities on both sides. Now, I think that increasingly, for example, on the line of control, both countries are seeing the advantage of scaling down the rhetoric and working out a way to manage this problematic relationship.
What's very clear is that there will be a strengthening of the countries of the Quad, maybe including the Quad Plus, which has countries like South Korea and Vietnam jumping into this democratic alliance as well. But the question is, how far will this go? One of the defining features of the first Cold War between the USSR and the USA was the presence of a NATO alliance, which was a virtual guarantor of peace for all NATO countries. Now, India, throughout the First Cold War, stayed away from any military alliance with either the USSR or with the United States. Our policy then was of non-alignment, but of course India's territorial integrity wasn't threatened either by the USSR or by the USA. So I want to put that question first to Admiral Shekhar Sinha. How far do you believe this strengthening of the relationship among Quad countries or Quad plus countries is likely to go? Do you believe ultimately we're headed in the direction of a NATO-style alliance? India has never been part of a military alliance before this. Would that make sense? Is that how far we should push, Admiral Sinha?
I don't think so, Rahul, that it will be an alliance. It will remain a cooperative arrangement. And as you rightly said, how far will they go? Well, they will ensure the free and open seas. They will ensure that there is no restriction put by anybody. Overflights are permitted and the legal trade is being done. And wherever it is being hampered or likely to be hampered, the navies of these countries, 4 at the moment and maybe later on 5, 6, 7, they will come together. What has happened is that, in the South China Sea, presence of these 4 navies at any particular time will encourage the ASEAN countries to lend their support to this because they didn't have much voice. And you see what Vietnam has made a statement just a few days back. So they are all waiting for some security backup to resist or to make sure that China does not claim all those areas which actually belong to the ASEAN countries. So I think it will remain an arrangement. It will become a security architecture. Cannot be called an alliance because in alliance what happens is that you have to have an alliance leader and you have to obey what he says. And it is very unlikely it will remain a cooperative arrangement. And I would think that depending upon which part of the sea you are in, if it is in Pacific...
Okay, Amitabh Mattu, your sense of how far the Quad cooperation is likely to go and what role the Quad plus countries like Vietnam, South Korea, how will they be involved in what happens over the next few months? And to what extent do you think the security cooperation will go? Will it ultimately be some kind of a mini NATO?
First of all, I have the freedom as an academic not to be my thought experiments not to be undermined by the coyness of political correctness. So, I don't find anything fundamentally threatening about an alliance. But I think the level of proximity of these countries, 4 countries right now, the Quad now, but the Quad plus, as you pointed out, Vietnam, South Korea, Singapore, and others, will depend on 3 things. First of all, the manner in which China acts. Now, China's military activities, together with trying to weaponize multilateralism, using its economics as a weapon of war, the more it does it, the greater the proximity. Secondly, if these countries begin to see a bandwagoning, what happens in a bandwagoning? If there's a decline in America, Trump or his successor turns isolationist, they're coalescing around China because China seems the more attractive hegemonic power in the making. And if the Southeast Asian countries decide to coalesce around China, then you will begin to feel greater pressure on this side for the Quad to act with greater coordination and with greater level of military cooperation at every level, including in the form of an alliance structure. And finally, it will depend on the superpower of the day, which is the United States of America. I do not believe that that the kind of vacillation that we have seen within the Trump administration holds good for India. I think what you will see ultimately is beyond November, if you have a post-Trump government, the degree of engagement with what is the Indo-Pacific will determine again how much of a cooperation there exists.
So, Dr. Ian Hall, we are hearing 2 different perspectives. The military man on the broadcast says that there shouldn't be a military alliance, that it's not really required, just a security architecture which is mutually beneficial is enough. The academic says, why be coy about this? For all practical purposes, it may not be a NATO-style military alliance, but it is ultimately going to end up in some kind of a military alliance. What's your view, and also what role do you see the Quad plus countries play?
Look, I think there are 2 dimensions to alliances. One of them is a political aspect, and the other one is the military side of things. I agree that on the military side of things, it would be very helpful to have more formalized, institutionalized relationships between the various different armed forces, as you do in a place like NATO, and also the other aspect of this is to try and improve interoperability. And I think that's one area in which there's very great patchiness. So in the case of Australia and the United States, Japan and the United States, clearly there are very high levels of interoperability. That's not the case with India. India, partly because of the platforms it operates, but also because of its the way in which it's operated for some period of time. It's just not as closely integrated into US systems for communications, for example. Now, we've seen attempts to try and improve that, but it's going to take a little bit of time to do that. The political side of things, though, is that we have to remember that alliances actually, in the beginning, are often based on mistrust, not trust between partners. In the case of the NATO alliance, it was about trying to keep the Americans in Europe to stop them from withdrawing from Europe after 1945, as they had done after the First World War. The alliance with the Japanese was also about mistrust. It was about trying to hold on to the Japanese, prevent them from becoming another militaristic power as they had done. And in the case of Australia and the United States, it was about trying to keep the United States' presence in the Pacific because there was a fear that if Australia was left on its own, it would end up in trouble. So now, in the current situation, though, we actually have pretty high levels of trust and understanding between the various different partners. And that's a kind of an unusual situation. We know where India sits with regard to China. India now knows where Australia sits, regardless of the economic interdependence. So given that we have high levels of trust, we can rely on each other, I think, on the political side of things, and we don't necessarily need to have those automatic tripwires that alliances put in place in order to ensure that one partner or another doesn't renege on their obligations in a time of emergency. So, I mean, I think there's in other words, there's a case for an alliance, I think, on the military side of things. There's a case for working more closely together, and we absolutely have to do that. But we don't actually need to have a formal treaty alliance in order to make that happen.
Okay, so I'm out of time on this conversation, but we've, had some interesting exchange of thoughts. One, very clearly there'll be a strengthening of cooperation amongst the Quad countries. The countries in the ASEAN region will look for the moves that the big Quad countries make, because if they see that there is some stability, some backing that they can count on, then maybe some of those ASEAN countries will also start, because they're equally threatened by China's military aggression, they will also start coming on board the idea of a Quad Plus. This is a story that we'll track very, very closely. Many big developments expected over the next few days and weeks, and we'll have our eyes on that. For the time being, Admiral Shekhar Sinha, Dr. Ian Hall, Andrew Fung, and Professor Amitabh Mattu for joining us on the Newstrack. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this broadcast where we really looked at what form of cooperation we're likely to see between India, Australia, Japan and the United States, the role that countries like South Korea, Vietnam can play in the idea of a Quad Plus, and where this military alliance goes from here in trying to contain China's belligerence. Thank you for tuning in. We'll have more for you on the other side. Stay with us.
Hi everyone, Preeti Chaudhary here. Hope you like this video. For latest news and analysis, like and subscribe to the India Today YouTube channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated. Thank you for watching.